Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode a 9-foot tall ET. This is the story of a woman I'll call Jill Wheeler. That's not her real name. She requested to be anonymous, but she's had lifelong experiences with extraterrestrials, different types, and has a very unusual and interesting story to tell. Jill was born in 1960 in Carbondale, Illinois, and had her first encounter at age 5 in 1965. At this time, her mother had actually covered the windows of their house with tin foil. This is an important detail, as we shall soon see. So Jill wakes up one evening. She's going through a lot of growing pains at this time. So she climbs out of her crib and goes into the living room looking for her dad so he can massage her legs. Unfortunately, it's too late. Everyone's asleep. And she sees something weird coming through the wall. She quickly hides under the couch, but it doesn't do any good because whoever or whatever is coming through the wall knows where she is. And I'll just let Jill describe what happened. As she says, "This is going to sound really stupid, but I looked across to the opposite wall and I saw this line of teddy bear looking things coming through the wall. There were maybe 5 or 6 of them. They literally looked like teddy bears. Anyway, they knew where I was. I remember hearing in my head, 'Come out.' So I came out and they put me in front of them and we marched down the hallway where I crawled back into my crib." So back in her crib and her room filled with these figures, Jill stared at them and watched them as they transformed from teddy bears into what we now know are gray aliens. As Jill says, they changed. They no longer looked like teddy bears. There was one who was maybe 5 feet tall, and he looked like what I guess you would call a gray, only taller. He was skinny, spindly, had a big head, big eyes. The other ones were smaller than he was. The tall gray walked over to Jill and had a question for her. As Jill says, he demanded to know why the aluminum foil was up on my window. I told him it was because my mother put it up there to keep the heat out from the sun, and he did not accept that explanation. And he asked me again, and I told him again, and he still didn't accept it. And he looked at me and he asked me again, and I told him again, and by then I was getting a little scared and a little irritated. And finally, the 3rd or 4th time I told him, he looked at me for a couple of seconds, went, "Uh-huh," and then he turned around and went back to whatever they were doing in the middle of the room. So Jill looks to the middle of the room at this point, and all the grays are there in the middle of her room, setting up what looks like a pedestal with a black box on it. And one of the grays walks up to her and tells her to go get some water, which Jill did. She went into the bathroom, got a little bathtub pail, filled it with water and brought it to them, and they asked her to do it again. As Jill says, and I quote, "So I went to get some more water, and this happened at least 10 times. Finally, I was so tired of crawling in and out of bed, going to get the water, taking it back and giving it to him, doing it over and over, that the last time he asked me to do it, I sat in the middle of my crib and I said, 'No, I'm not going to do it. I'm tired.' And he looked at me with these eyes you could not believe. It was just an intense kind of looking right through me. I could feel that he was looking into my mind to see if that was true, if that's how I really felt. He did that for a short amount of time, and he kind of withdrew whatever was coming out of his eyes to look into me with. It wasn't anything physical. I could just feel that he was looking in there. So he seemed to accept it, and he turned around and went back to what they were doing. So they played around with this black box on this pedestal for just a few more moments, and then suddenly packed up all their equipment and walked through the walls, and they were gone. That was Jill's first encounter. It was shortly after this encounter that Jill went to the doctor and was diagnosed with tuberculosis. This was quite shocking to her and her family. They had no idea how she had contracted this disease. They contacted a lot of people that she had associated with. There was really no source for it that they could find. But following this diagnosis, Jill had to go to the doctor every year and take lung x-rays. This would later become significant. So for some years, she had no other encounters. But then, one day when she was about 9 years old, the Greys came back. And Jill had no fear at this point. In fact, she remembers this first encounter and the ones after it being very positive. And I'll just let Jill again describe what happened. As she says in her own words, "That night, I remember something came and got me out of my bed. It was not unpleasant. Whatever it was, it told me things. I learned things. I don't remember what they were, but I remember that they were just amazing to me. They were just wow. I thought they were so important, and this went on for a while." Here's where her story gets even more interesting. The ETs told her that any time that she was ready to have contact, all she had to do was give them this little secret sign, this little signal, which involved her putting a blanket on the foot of her bed all rolled up. As Jill says in her own words, "I was to make a signal with a little blanket that I had. They actually asked me to make this signal with this blanket, to fold it up at the bottom of my bed if it was all right to come and take me that night. If not, then I wasn't to put the blanket there. So I'd put the blanket there maybe every few days, something like that." So these encounters went on for years, from around age 9 to 12. Jill estimates that there were hundreds of them. But whatever it was the Greys were teaching her, she could not remember. As she says, and I quote, "I would go somewhere, and I know I did. And I know that I was taught things, and I know that they were really, really important. I felt it was really important at that time. It was not scary. It wasn't evil. I enjoyed it. And it was so important to me that when I got back, I would try to write something down, some phrase that would help me remember what I had just learned. I started to keep a paper and a pencil next to my bed. And as soon as I put the pencil on the paper, I would get maybe a couple of letters out and the whole thing would be gone from my mind. And I would sit there, frustrated, just, oh my God, I can't believe this. And I tried night after night, every time it happened. I tried so hard. It got so that as soon as I realized I was back in bed, I would grab the pencil and paper that very second. And as soon as the pencil hit the paper, it would just go poof, gone, completely out of my head." After nearly 3 years of trying, Jill finally did get one message. It turned out to be her last encounter. As Jill says, "The last one of those that I remember was, I remember being told when I was about 12 years old, I would forget everything. I would not have this experience anymore, and I would forget about what I had been taught. Later on, it would be restored. And sure enough, when I was 12, it stopped happening, and I forgot about it." So that was a series of encounters that occurred from age 9 to 12. And it was around this time that Jill had her first UFO sighting. Her family had moved from Illinois to a little town in Nebraska, a small rural town. It was around 1972, and one evening, Jill and her neighborhood friend went outside and were laying on the station wagon, looking at the stars, when suddenly this huge triangular ship came overhead. It was just a few 100 feet high, totally silent, and absolutely unexplained. As Jill says, it was so big that it blocked out the moon, it blocked out the stars, and it was moving very, very slowly. It didn't make a sound at all. So they watched this thing move overhead and disappear off into the distance, but they didn't tell anyone about it. They didn't talk about it. They felt strangely sedated after this incident. As Jill says, we didn't really talk too much about it. We kind of said, "What's that?" And we watched it, and that's about all we said, which is kind of strange if you think about it. So they didn't tell anyone about it, and they kind of just forgot about it. And after that, Jill's life carried on as normal for years. She went to school, went to college, got married. She and her husband bought a house. She got pregnant, had her first kid. Not long after that, she had her second kid. And then weird things started to happen. She went to the doctor for her x-rays of her lungs and got a huge shock. The doctor called her back and wanted to see her, so that he had found something in her lungs. And I'll just let Jill describe this incident. As she says, the next day I got a call from the doctor, and not to be alarmed, but they had found something in my lung and they don't know what it is. I had a 6-month-old baby. My husband and I were pretty alarmed. We thought, cancer, tuberculosis, what is it? And the doctor said he had no idea. He couldn't even give me a guess. So we went in and we sat down in his office, and he showed me that I have a metal ring in my left lung. He didn't know what it was. He knew it was metallic. He didn't know where it came from or how it could possibly have gotten in there. I mean, we talked about every possibility there could be. I had never had any kind of surgery other than tonsils. There's no way I could have inhaled something that big. I mean, I think I would remember. It was fairly large. She asked her doctor, well, are we going to go in and take it out? And the doctor told her, no. What we are going to do is watch it. What I want you to do is come in every 3 months for the next year, and we will take x-rays, and we will see if anything is developing around it or if there are any abnormalities. So that's what they did. And there weren't any other abnormalities. She felt no symptoms. The only thing they noticed, the only change, was that tissue did start to accumulate and grow around this ring. But there was no foreign body reaction. She felt fine. So they just kept it in there, and it's still in there to this day, and they don't know what it is. So Jill had another baby, and this is when more weird things started to happen. For as long as Jill could remember, she had a very strange symptom. The tip of her nose was really, really sensitive. This little lump had appeared at some point. She's not sure when. It seemed like it was always there. But it was so sensitive to the touch, it would cause excruciating pain, that she simply didn't touch it. And then one day she's changing the diaper of her newborn baby, and this thing just fell out of her nose. And when she looked at it, she got a shock because it was not normal. As she says, and I quote, I had just finished changing my son's diaper, and I stood up, and as I stood up, this thing fell out of my nose and into my hand. I looked at it, and it looked like a spool of thread. The spool the thread is on, except really, really tiny, like the size of a half grain of rice. It was about that size, and it was white. She immediately flicked it onto the carpet, and then realizing what she had done and how unusual this thing was, she got down on her hands and knees and searched for it, but was never able to find it. And it was following this that Jill started to get really sick. She had gained some weight from her third pregnancy and was somewhere around 200 pounds. But following this apparent implant coming out of her body, she started to lose weight rapidly. She started to become very weak. She started fainting first once or twice a day. This was around 1992. This went on for 3 years. So around 1995, she says she was fainting about 4, 5 times a day. She would eat, get a rush of energy, and then lose all her energy and faint. She did, of course, go to the doctor. The doctors thought she might have diabetes. She does have diabetes in her family, but no, she did not have diabetes. They didn't know what she had. Jill did her own research, and she thought it was some form of hypoglycemia. The doctors weren't sure. They just gave her a sort of cocktail of vitamins and told her that they would watch her condition. But as Jill says, I was afraid to eat. By the end of 3 years, I was just at my wit's end. I was at the end of my rope. I was very, very, very sick. So she was losing a lot of weight. Things were going downhill. She didn't know what she was going to do. And in 1995, she had the single most unusual UFO experience of her entire life. She had woken up in the middle of the night to go get a peanut butter sandwich and some juice, in case she needed to eat it to stabilize her blood sugar. And the next thing she knows is she's walking across her living room. She's no longer in her house. She's someplace else. And it looked like this huge stadium with a domed ceiling and indirect lighting. And it was just gigantic. And again, I'll let Jill describe in her own words where she found herself. As Jill says, it was like inside a domed stadium, that kind of roof. It was all white. It had backlighting in there. The walls were all lit up and light was coming down from the ceiling, but you couldn't see any light fixtures. And it was just huge, just humongous. All throughout the place, as far as I could see where I was sitting, were cubicles. Aisles and aisles of cubicles, like you'd find if you walked into a bank or business. These cubicles were blue in color, and looking down at the floor, she saw that it was carpeted with what looked like a tough industrial-type carpet. And she's looking around trying to orient herself. And as she says, I was sitting there, and I began to notice what was in my immediate area. I was inside a cubicle, and I was sitting on a long steel table like you'd find in any doctor's office. I was wondering, what the heck am I doing here? What is this? And I looked up, and across the aisle from me in another cubicle was sitting a man. He had on a plaid shirt, blue jeans, a belt, and those thick-soled work boots. He looked about my age, which would have been about 35. He looked at me. I looked at him. He was completely human-looking. I had no idea at this point that I was anywhere other than a human place, but I didn't know where I was. I had never been in a place like that. And I didn't know how I got there. I was just really confused. So she and this man start to talk to each other. He introduces himself as Cooper. She gives her name, and they're both dazed, disoriented, almost sedated, and they're trying to figure out where the heck they are and what is going on, when as she's talking to this man, Cooper, he suddenly falls unconscious. His eyes are still open, but he's like dazed, hypnotized, and apparently unable to move. This made her quite frightened. She heard a sound coming from the corridor and got a real shock. Looking down the corridor, she saw someone that she first thought was human, except as he got closer, he clearly wasn't, and he was about 8 or 9 feet tall. She thinks 9. And I'll just let Jill describe what happened next. I thought it was a human being, a very tall, very well-developed human being, until it got close enough for me to see its face. Then I knew it wasn't human. It had a cape on. It had on clothing that was tight. I can't remember the material. I just remember that I could see its muscles through its clothing. It had a belt on, and as it got closer, I saw the face, and it was huge. Its forehead was way, way too high to have been a human being, and its hair was bright orange and sticking straight up about 2 inches. It was kind of like thin straw or wheat in texture. There was something about his chin, too. It was way too big and way too broad. And that's when I realized something was really, really wrong. And at that point, I knew that it just wasn't human. I was terrified. I was horrified. I thought this thing was coming to kill me. He was just a few feet from me, and I was screaming and screaming. I thought I was going to die. I've never been so terrified in all my life. Jill can now see that there's a tray filled with what appears to be surgical instruments right next to her. This 9-foot-tall being walks into her cubicle and says, "Okay, Jill, now it's your turn." And he takes his cape and wraps her body tightly up in it. And then he picks up these instruments that look like little silver bells. And he takes one bell and puts it on her pancreas, or near the pancreas and the liver. And he took the other bell and slid it underneath her left side, near what she believes are her kidney and adrenal glands. And when he said, "Okay, Jill, now it's your turn," this was Jill's response. He didn't say it in a caring, kind, compassionate way. He didn't say it in a mean, cruel, evil way. He just said it like he was talking to a lab rat. So after this figure placed these bell-like instruments on Jill's body, she started to feel this energy pulsating from these instruments into her body. This made her even more terrified, and she was screaming in fear. She tried to say the Lord's Prayer, but she was too terrified to even remember it. And the next thing she knows, she's back in her living room. She's breathless, she's sweaty, she's hyperventilating, she's standing up, and she's quite scared. She immediately runs up to her husband and tries to wake him up. He will not wake up, despite, her shaking him very hard. She runs to wake up her children. They won't wake up. It takes her basically 20 minutes to wake up her family. She tells her husband what happened. He's absolutely baffled, mystified, concerned, but very supportive of her. He believes her. He can see that she's very upset, but he doesn't know what to make of this experience. And for that matter, neither did Jill. Her body was quite sore. She went to bed. The next morning, she wakes up and goes into her child's room and gets a real shock. As she says, "The night after it happened, I was putting my son to bed. He was 3 years old then. He looked outside the window. It was right above his head. And he looked at the moon and he said, 'Mommy, I went on a ship to the moon last night.' And Jill looked at him with amazement and said, 'You did, honey. Where did you go?' And he said, 'Went on ship, went on ship.' And he pointed to the moon. And she said, 'You did? When?' And he said, 'Last night.' So that freaked her out. As Jill says, I didn't ask him anything else. I was horrified. But here's where her story, again, gets even more interesting. Because following this experience in this weird place with this 9-foot-tall figure, Jill comes back. Her body's very sore. But in the days that followed, she noticed something really remarkable. She was no longer fainting. In fact, she felt quite good. Her soreness lasted about 2 weeks, but she started to gain weight. She started to be able to eat normally again. She was no longer fainting. As Jill says, at the end of that week, when I finally realized what's going on here, I'm not getting sick anymore, I connected it to what had happened that night. And at that point, I began to wonder, who was that? And why me? Why would they come and heal me? Over the next month or so, I began to lose a little bit of the fear and get a great curiosity. They hadn't hurt me. They had fixed me. I still didn't feel any warm, fuzzy feelings towards them, because that's not the impression they gave me. I was a lab rat, that's what I felt like. I don't know what I am to them. Why would they come and heal me like that? I don't know. I really have no idea, and I would like to know. So this was when Jill really connected this all to the UFO phenomena. She was absolutely perplexed. She wants to know what this figure was. This was why she contacted me. She wanted to know if I had ever heard of anyone describing this kind of figure. And I had to tell her, no, I didn't. I had heard of other healing cases, but hadn't heard of a story quite like hers. So this was very perplexing to her, and she wasn't long after this that she had another really dramatic UFO sighting. She was driving with a family friend I'll call David, and it started out with a weird premonition. As Jill says, all of a sudden I had this feeling like he needed to pull off the road because something very, very bad was going to happen. And she turned to David, who was driving, and said, "You need to pull off the road." And he asked, "Why? Do you need to go to the bathroom?" And she said, "No." And he said, "Well, I'm not pulling over." And Jill said, "Okay." And she says, "I tried to ignore the feeling. It would go away, and then it would come back. And each time it came back, I felt worse and worse. The third time I tried to ignore it, it actually was going to make me throw up." So she turned to her friend David and said, "You've got to pull off the road right now. Get off the road at the very next exit. Do it now." And seeing how upset Jill was, David pulled off at the nearest exit into a truck stop and turns to her and says, "Okay, now what?" And Jill felt embarrassed. The feeling she had was completely gone. And she looked at her friend David and said, "I'm sorry. I just had a really, really bad feeling that you had to pull off the road right now." So they got back on the road and started driving, and this is when this huge UFO appeared. It was a very large, round, silver object. And Jill shouted out, "Look, oh my God, it's a UFO. Look, up in the sky." And her friend David completely ignored her, pretended she hadn't said anything. And she turned to him and said, "What's the matter with you? Look up in the sky." And David said, "I'm not going to look." Jill was shocked, and she told him again, Look at that thing. It's just hanging in the air, floating. Don't you see that silver thing floating there? Look." And David got angry, and he said, "I'm not going to look." So Jill started to get angry as well. She said, "Why? Why aren't you going to look?" She was afraid it was going to disappear, and she really wanted another witness. And David shouted at her, "I am not looking." And she said, "What is the matter with you? Hurry up and look. It's going to be gone. Can't you just look and tell me what you think it is?" And he said, "No, I'm not going to look. Stop asking me." So Jill stared at this object. She was very confused by her friend's reaction. As she says, "I couldn't understand why he was angry or why he wouldn't look. So I was looking at it, and as I watched it, it just went zoom, and it disappeared off into the distance, and it was gone." And she turned to David and said, "Well, it's gone. What's the matter with you? Why wouldn't you look at it?" And her friend replied, "I don't want to talk about it." So she didn't, and they never discussed it again. She could tell that David was angry and upset by this object. She wondered if he had had encounters, but she never got to follow up on it because a few years later, David passed away. So that was another very strange incident that she was never able to explain. And it wasn't that much longer after that, some years, about 8 years or so, that she had another very strange encounter. It was 2003. She went to bed as normal, and woke up, and again she was in a different place. And again, I'll just let Jill describe in her own words what happened. As she says, I was in the same kind of place with this domed, white-walled kind of area. I was walking down a black rubber runner rug. I came to the end of this long table, and there were these not quite human-looking beings sitting at the table, maybe 4 on each side. They had light-colored kind of thin hair down to shoulder length. They had on light-colored clothes. I didn't know who they were or why I was there. It felt very real, and I was just waiting. I don't know for what. I assumed there was something they wanted me there for. And they said something about this child being very intelligent. And I thought they were talking about my son, because he is intelligent. And I said, well, what do you expect? He's got the Wheeler genes. And as soon as I said that, these beings turned and looked at me with such a pitying expression, like, you think that is intelligent? It was like these people considered that kind of intelligence to be the intelligence of an animal, like a dog. It was that kind of withering, patronizing, pitiful look. And at this point, one of these beings stood up, led Jill out of the room into the room right by it, the adjacent room. And she first noticed the floor, which looked like hard plastic, she said, with a raised circular pattern, kind of like a giant bath mat, is how she said. And this being escorted her to the center of the room where there was this platform. And on this platform, there was a little girl. And she estimates this girl was about 5 years old. And the being told Jill, this is your child. And as Jill says, I walked up to the platform and the little girl, and I looked at her. She did not look any different from a normal human child, except she was kind of frail looking. She didn't look like my kids, for instance, who are very strong and robust. She looked frail and kind of pale. She had really fine, stringy, white-colored hair. Her face didn't look any different than a human face, except there was something about her eyes. They were a little bit bigger, and they were blue. Jill's memory becomes very hazy at this point. She remembers becoming very emotional and asked to hug the child. And she did. The two of them embraced. And at this point, Jill asked the child, why don't you come home with me? And the child replied, no, I belong here. And Jill felt this enormous wave of love and sadness sweep over her. But at the same time, she somehow understood. She turned around and began to exit the room. And the next thing she knows, she's waking up in bed, and the experience was over. And that was her last UFO experience up to this date. And this haunted her. This is when she really began researching the UFO subject, when she contacted me to find out if there were other people who had had experiences like her. She did research herself and found out that the teddy bears she saw were likely screen memories. She read about many other people who had described seeing a black box. She even found another case involving people who put tinfoil up on the windows. It's very strange. I wonder why the ETs were so concerned about that. Did it block them from surveilling her or being able to come into her room? They did seem quite upset about it. But Jill is absolutely certain that she's a contactee. She doesn't know where she was taken to. She feels like it might have been an underground base, certainly in that big stadium-like area with the industrial-looking carpeting and the cubicles. But she has no idea. And she has no idea why she was healed. She says she's nobody special. She's just a housewife from Nebraska. Her husband is, I believe, a mechanic. So I don't know. It's a very strange series of events with some very strange and unique details, though many details I've certainly heard before. The screen memories are somewhat familiar. The black box is a detail I've heard in many other cases. Certainly being healed is something I've heard many times from various contactees. And also hybrid babies as well. But other details, I've never heard of anyone describing a 9-foot tall, essentially human-looking ET with orange spiky hair. I don't know. I did cover Jill's story in my book, Inside UFOs. It's one of the strangest encounters I've ever had the privilege to research. And I think that's really why I wanted to do this episode for you today, because it's just such a strange and unusual encounter. Jill absolutely insists this is 100% true. As she says, I know what I saw. That's about all I have to give. I will take a lie detector test. Anything anybody wants. So yeah, I am not sure what to make of this encounter, other than I think that it has a lot of details I've heard before. The hybrid babies, the implants, the screen memories, all of this stuff are details I've heard again and again. It's a very unusual encounter. I think it has quite a bit to say about the nature of this phenomena, which again is why I wanted to do this episode for you today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I really appreciate you watching, and until next time, keep having fun.